Welcome back, everybody. I'm Sandy Rosenthal, host of Beat the Big Guys podcast, and I have a very special guest with us today. His name is Jim Schoenbeck. Hello, Jim.
Howdy, how are y'all?
We are wonderful. Thank you. I love that you say y'all. We do that too in New Orleans. I love hearing that.
It works in every situation. It was way ahead of its time.
I agree with you. It's very handy dandy. So I've been doing a lot of research on my guests, but for those of you out there nationwide may not know who Mr. Jim Schoenbeck is, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him right now. Jim is a Dallas-Fort Worth native and director of Downwinders at Risk. He's been a professional community organizer since 1989 when he opened the Dallas office of the National Toxics Campaign. He's one, helped shut down an outlaw lead smelter in Frisco. Two, effectively banned gas drilling in Dallas. And three, stopped the burning of hazardous waste in local cement kilns. That's a lot of work, and I look forward to hearing more about it. He recently assisted in the campaign to clean up Shingle Mountain, an infamous 6-story illegal pile of hazardous waste shingles overwhelming a southern Dallas neighborhood. This is the story that was covered in the Washington Post. That is very impressive because it's difficult to get the attention of the Washington Post. Congratulations, Jim.
Well, you can thank the people that brought that 6 tons of hazardous shingle waste to Marcia Jackson's backyard.
I suppose so, but the fact that you got that story into the Washington Post, and that it was covered, it's not as easy as people think, and you all did it. So congratulations.
No, and we were very lucky too, in that somebody that I work in the same building with knew the environmental writer at the Washington Post because of a previous assignment through their newspaper work in another town altogether. So even though they were now apart, they knew each other from this former job. She was interested in this story and had been tracking it and referred it to him, and then he followed up. It was all very serendipitous.
And
but if you work hard enough, those kinds of opportunities present themselves. So
that's exactly what I was just going to tell our listeners. These opportunities, if you keep at it and work hard enough, these opportunities show up and you take advantage of them. That's what you do.
Right. No, you keep, you want to, that's why you cast a wide as net as possible when you're doing your public relations or whatever you're doing. Making sure that everybody on earth and their mother knows about what you're doing, because you never know how that's going to pay off. Somebody will know somebody that knows somebody. And that was one of these cases where it was very fortuitous. And of course, like many cities, the only way that we could get our city government to act in that situation was to basically shame them. And
right.
National publicity goes a long way toward doing that.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about that today. And as for saying your message over and over and over, I'm just going to add one thing to that. Don't stop until people line up at your front door and ask you to stop. Right?
Right. Well, I don't want to be, we try not to be abusive about it unless we're fundraising. We try to bring them straight ahead news. And when we put out calls for action, I think people know that we're serious because of our track record. So we try not to use it in a frivolous way.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is our reputation. We tend to have, I would hope that we have a reputation for getting stuff done, that we don't mess around, that if we've decided something is a project, it's probably going to be a pretty serious project, and we're going to be pretty serious about solving the problems.
Well, that's something worth its weight in gold. And I hope we get a chance to talk about that a little bit more in today's episode. So, but first, I've got to share with our listeners the name of the college that you founded. This is a real name, the College of Constructive Hellraising. Well, that is interesting. Well, one thing I think is great about it is it's clear what it is. And you use the word constructive. So in other words, you're stirring the pot, but you're being constructive about it. I think it's a great name, but why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about this college that you founded?
Well, part of it is because of the reason that you just cited, was that it was very direct and clear cut in its meaning. There are a lot of these schools, part of it is a parody shtick. Part of it is kind of a joke on the Midwest Academy, loving joke, because I love them a lot, and other kinds of places that have a more highfalutin name. And since we were kind of the dollar store version of all that, we decided we probably didn't want to assume that kind of name. And here's a name that we could have fun with. The other thing is, I think that's exactly it. It's not only tells you what we're about, but it tells you what we're in the business of doing. And it's to distinguish the kind of hell raising that might be going on in New Orleans on any given night down at the Quarter, that may or may not be so constructive, but we try to make ours constructive. It's the same thing that John Lewis talked about in terms of good trouble, right? It's the same difference. I just like alliteration.
How long ago did you found your college?
We came into being the same month that Donald Trump assumed the presidency, January of 2017.
Was that a coincidence?
Not one that I wanted to see happen, certainly, but one that turned out to be, I don't want to say fortuitous, but it changed our group completely. Because up until that point, Downwinders had been pursuing an anti-smog strategy that had been a big bugaboo of ours from almost the get-go of the group. And we were on the verge of trying to get the federal government to come in and take over a clean air plan instead of having the state do it in a not very good way over and over again, which they're never serious about doing in Texas. We wanted the feds to come in, at this point, the Obama administration, to come in as the EPA and take it over, which they never, it's almost blasphemy in Texas to suggest such a thing, but we were building support for that. And then the November election happened, and that strategy literally disappeared overnight. And we had to find something else to do. And we did find that. We as a group pivoted toward particulate matter pollution as a focus and environmental justice as a way to pursue that, because that primarily is the demographic that's harmed most by that kind of pollution, by soot pollution. Black and brown communities, especially in Texas and Dallas, Fort Worth, where we operate. So that made us forget all about the smog stuff and find another reason for being that wasn't dependent on the federal government for action, because it was apparent that that was not going to happen. And the way that you regulate particulate matter was through local ordinances, zoning, changing things to electric fleets and so forth. There was going to be a lot more wiggle room and opportunity for us to make change at the local level pursuing this agenda than an anti-smog agenda at the federal level. At the same time that was happening was when this change in the group was happening was when we opened the college for the first time. And it had a couple of milk runs here and there, not in its entirety, but kind of 3 or 4 courses at a time over here, just to see if the format would work, if the topics were right and so forth.
Are the courses in person only?
Yeah, it's really, it's kind of like a seminar class. And it's only 10 sessions, right? We meet only twice a month. But the idea is to communicate specific organizing principles. We're from kind of the old school Alinsky approach to things and really believe in grassroots community organizing and observing kind of that approach to the work. But we also present in the second part of every session an example of how that strategy worked in the local Dallas-Fort Worth scene over the last 50 or 60 years, with civil rights, with LGBTQ, with police brutality, with anti-nuke work, with other environmental issues and so forth. We bring in somebody that was on the front lines of that fight. Say in 1970, we have Peter Johnson always come in and initiate the program. He was sent in by Dr. King to organize, or by the SCLC to organize a showing of a film about Dr. King right after the assassination. He was on staff at the time. Wow. And he was in the room with Andrew Young and all those, everybody that you read about in the history books. He was in the room as a 19-year-old. And he got sent out to Dallas to organize this movie showing, and he was supposed to return right back to Atlanta. And instead, he's ended up staying about 60 years in town and started a whole lot of trouble when he was here over a local situation.
That's a fascinating story. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. And
No, so he always opens that up, and then we go from there forward chronologically about social justice campaigns in DFW and so forth, and we work our way up to almost the present day. So
that's incredible. So it is so intriguing, and I hope when the day comes that you expand and start having some guests via Zoom, that you'll consider having me as a guest. I'm just so interested in this.
Well, I tell you what, we're very old school. What we do is we have these seminar classes that are never bigger than, like 20 or so people. And this year it's actually going to be limited to 15. And we have these sessions, and then we make sure there's always kind of a social hour afterwards where we go to a restaurant or bar, and people have an opportunity to have one-on-ones, not only with the guest lecturer, who's a figure in history they may or may not have ever met before, but with each other as well. And so part of the idea of this school is to create slowly but surely a culture in Dallas-Fort Worth of change makers that kind of speak the same language and know each other and so forth.
Well, I can live with just having been told that I'm too high tech. I can live with that. So I'll be able to sleep tonight, being turned down by my offer, but because I'm just too advanced in this old school.
Well, we ended up in 2020 having to go to Zoom midway through the class. Right. And for me, it was just very unsatisfying.
I understand. I understand.
Fulfill the requirements of what it was supposed to give you as a result of this experience. So we'll see what happens. We're taking all the precautions that we can, ramping this up. We took last year off. So this will be a new experience. Every class is different, and different
good luck.
Different experiences. So,
good luck. So Jim, you told me that you have, before we started, we chatted a little bit. You said you had at least one favorite story in your arsenal that you could share with our listeners, where you took on the big guys and won, and beat up against the establishment and won. So we were all waiting to hear one of your favorite stories.
Okay, and with the caveat that it's not me, it's a person that is made of much stouter stuff than me. Her name is Marcia Jackson, and this is quite an incredible story. Marcia Jackson is a Black woman in her 60s. She's a great grandmother. Her daughter went to a local university on a rodeo scholarship. They're
Jim,
involved.
Could we pause just for a second? So will I be able to ask questions about this story? Because I'm going to.
Yeah. No, we were involved. You'll see how we were.
So
involved.
This is a story that you're very familiar with, the ins and outs of. It's not
very familiar with, and it has a happy ending.
Okay. Proceed, Jess. You'll take care of that. I've got a producer who'll clean up the audio afterward. Okay. Marcia, please proceed.
Okay, Marcia Jackson was this incredibly warm-hearted, I believe 60-something-year-old grandmother whose daughter went to college on a rodeo scholarship. Their whole family's involved in Black rodeo culture, trail riding culture. She owns a couple of acres out on the edge of southern Dallas that she raised horses and other animals on, and had a riding trail association come out there quite a bit. And it was kind of the pastoral life for her. And she had a middle-class job at AT&T and just was doing everything right as a citizen and resident of Dallas that you're supposed to do. And then one morning she woke up and bulldozers were piling up and dumping this huge pile of shingles directly across from her barbed wire fence. I mean, there wasn't even there was nothing over there but literally the barbed wire fence. And I think it was might have been 5 strands, might have been only 3 at the time. So not very much. And as you can imagine, with each load, huge amount of dust, debris comes up and so forth. The only thing now, that's on one side. The other side, there's the barbed wire fence and a little shallow creek that runs between her and this property. And they are now dumping this material into the creek. They're damming up the creek with this stuff. And so days go by, months go by, and she calls night. She does everything that you are supposed to do as a citizen and a resident. She calls 311. She tries to call a local city council person. She calls the state environmental agency. She calls EPA. She notifies everybody, and nothing is done about this for 11 months. And meanwhile, of course, they're still dumping, and this thing is growing daily in size, in width, and in height. And it's becoming a commercial operation. There are now, whole 18 wheelers, not just the little, mom and pop contractor trailer worth of shingles, but now they're showing up with 18 wheelers worth of the stuff and dumping there. And you can imagine her frustration. And she contacted another woman who they were both hanging out together at the same meeting over an EPA Superfund site in the neighborhood. If you can believe that, they were attending a neighborhood on another environmental issue when they said, hey, you should come to our meeting, and I'll introduce you to this group that we're working with, which was us, Downwinders at Risk. And so about a week or so later, Marcia Jackson made her way up to our meeting and said, here's what's going on. And of course, none of us really understood at the moment that she described it. It just sounded awful. But to me, I just couldn't believe anybody could get away with this without having some kind of permit. It couldn't be that. It couldn't be the way she described it. So I went out there myself, as you have to do, right? I mean, somebody reports this, you have to go out and do the inspection
with your
yourself.
own eyes. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And have a lay of the land and compare it to other things that you've seen and so forth. And I showed up at this place, and I could not believe it. It was like the 10th circle of hell. It was in the middle of the winter, so there wasn't any vegetation on the trees. That didn't help anything at all. So everything was already gray. But this whole area was just completely trashed, gray and black with shingles. And there was a huge pile. But not only that, most disturbing from our point of view, there were 2 large industrial grinders on site. I mean, not little things, but industrial sized grinders with conveyor belts that were conveying these whole shingles in, grinding them up without any pollution controls on them at all. And the cloud of debris around them was huge. And you could see this, you could see it. It wasn't, it was hard to miss. And it was creating this fog over this whole area. And the dam was, the creek was dammed over with these shingles. So much so that they had, when it had rained recently, it had backed up and sure enough flooded Marcia's whole backyard and destroyed a shed or two where she couldn't put her horses anymore back there. And these guys were taking in stuff in the front door. They were grinding this stuff at 2 locations on site. And again, there's nothing but a barbed wire fence separating a block of residential homes from this operation.
We definitely get this visual. You're doing a good job.
And it's quite incredible. I've been around a lot of facilities and a lot of, Superfund sites and obsolete factories and stuff, but this was just medieval looking stuff. It was amazing, especially the plumes from these grinders. And I couldn't believe it. So I sent out an SOS immediately to the local press, and thank God somebody that had the real estate of the local paper in Dallas responded. His name was Robert Wolanski. He was still city columnist at the time. He's a Dallas native. And he said, I'll come out and investigate it. And he couldn't believe what he saw. And when he couldn't believe what he saw, he went back to City Hall and tried to track down people and said, hey, do you know what's going on out there? And nobody, they all pretended not to know. And that was the first time, and he writes about it in his very first column. It was like he was telling them for the very first time about this problem, despite Marcia complaining to these very same people for the 11 months prior to that. That was December 2018. I thought surely one column exposing this stuff, they were scammed. There was no way you were going to have a permit for this stuff, just no way. And sure enough, they didn't, and that was revealed in short. And I thought that was going to be the end of it, but it wasn't. It was not. And the city didn't make any attempt to close it down. And we waited over the Christmas holidays, and they kept going and going. And the city kept saying, well, they're a legal business, blah, blah, blah. And there was no way that was true, but the city attorney's office swore that it was. And so in February of 2019, the group that Marcia now heads, Southern Sector Rising, was founded in our building as a result to take on this project. And we organized a March City Hall press conference that said, if you don't start to shut down this business and stop the flow of new trucks coming into this place, and now it was 5 or 6 stories tall, we're going to sit down in front of those trucks and keep new waste from being added to this pile, which we are sure is illegal as hell. Well, we scheduled this press conference. It took place in a nice City Hall conference room made just, available just for this purpose. It's called the Flag Room. And it's where all it's where the mayor does all his press conferences and so on. Very nice setting. We were going through the speakers, and there were several speakers from other previous environmental justice fights there speaking, and it was a very powerful presentation. And right in the middle of this press conference, Robert Wolonsky gets the notice that the city attorney's office has changed its mind, that this business is no longer legal, that this in fact is an illegal business, and they will be pursuing a shutdown of this business. That comes right during this press conference. I've never had that kind of cinematic moment during one of these things before. I mean, it was such that Marcia and I just embraced it. It was amazing, right? I mean, we didn't have to go through with that threat it was just the promise of getting busted, right? It's the protest that you never have to carry through that maybe sometimes is the most effective one, right? That you never have to have. So that was great. And they did file, but they didn't do anything about it after they shut it down. And so it kept becoming a health problem, and you'd have to talk to Marcia for a period of time to understand how it affected her lungs and her voice. She had to go start seeing a doctor, and there were kiddos on the block as well, youngsters that had to start breathing machines. And it was the amount of crud in the air during that period of time was incredible when the grinders were going on. Without the grinders, it wasn't quite so bad, but this stuff deteriorates daily. Shingles, you go out and do a geological survey of this thing, and at the top would be the whole shingles, and at the very bottom of the pile would just be this dust that would blow, and it would definitely affect people's health in the neighborhood. So we got put out with that instance, and the state and the city weren't doing anything. So we had to once again organize a campaign in that summer, beginning that summer, where we pressed the city to actually clean up the site and get rid of it it's an illegal dump. By the way, we were completely right about its status. They didn't have the right certificate of occupancy. The use they were using this land for was illegal from day one because it was in a floodplain, and they didn't have the right zoning for it. So all of that happened for almost a year without any official notice at all. Meanwhile, Marcia's yelling at the top of her lungs the best she can that this is going on, and nobody's paying attention to it until this column is written. And by the way, Robert wrote 13 columns over the next year and a half about this because it was so frustrating, and it was still there time and time again. When the city could have done something, they didn't. So the citizens organized a campaign that, for instance, involved a truck and a trailer, where we took a people's trial out to the mayor and other city council people that we thought were responsible for the delay in things, and put on a little law and order trial where we found each of them guilty for neglect and put a sign in the yard announcing their guilt and so on. And we staged a little play, 15-20 minute play out in front of the yard, in front of the residences. So we would drive in front of the mayor's home, do this with a little impromptu cast of players, one of whom would be playing the mayor, leave the sign there, and then go to the city manager's home and so forth. So
basically a spoof, like a satire, a spoof.
Yeah, we even played the Law and Order theme music at the beginning of each episode, just so people would know. And the neighbors got a big kick of that. That got a lot of coverage, great coverage. We did protest out the mayor's law firm. We had protest out at the site itself. We were threatening to do another round of civil disobedience. when again, and of course, then there was this the Washington Post came out with this story. The city began to change its mind, and then Soledad O'Brien came down and decided she wanted to use this as an example of environmental injustice, and used it as an hour-long episode of her series that was on last year about.
She was
there's a whole
CNN?
episode. No, it's on BET.
Okay.
I believe there was 5 or 6 episodes about different problems, and we were the environmental justice one. There's a whole episode on Shingle Mountain and Marcia. So all of this was making the city, putting them in the hot seat. And they finally decided that they were going to clean it up at the end of last year. And right now it is cleaned up. They actually have hauled stuff out of there. They now own that property. City does. And not only that, but the most amazing thing, while all this is going on, the neighborhood organized itself. They didn't have a neighborhood association out there because they didn't have, and this whole fight brought them together. Mm-hmm. And so now they have one of the best neighborhood associations in all of Dallas. And they put together their own neighborhood plan with help from planners in our board and who we have access to. They worked on it as residents themselves, and they decided, you know what, we want a park where that Shingle Mountain thing used to be. And my God, if it hasn't come true, they've gotten all kinds of help from engineers and park planners and local foundations. And there's actually now a Floral Farms Park.
Well, this is all incredible, and I'm gonna stop because we're gonna run out of time. We won't have any time for any to comment on what's going on. But I did want to, before we dig in a little deeper on some of the things you touched on, I have one question. Did this company ever get penalized for the illegal, without a zoning variance and without a permit? Was there any penalty fees?
So, well, in court, they were supposed to be assessing those fees. Has anybody done any time or paid any of those? No, because they can't find them and they can't. No, there's been no criminal or civil penalties assessed for these guys at all. In fact, they are actively going around trying to open up new businesses.
Of course they are.
Dallas and Fort Worth area. They have these guys were scammers from way back. They were real estate flip guys. They had all kinds of other side gigs going before they turned to the asphalt shingle recycling business.
And meanwhile, with the neighborhood association, they're gone. They're not going to spend their precious energy trying to get this organization penalized. They're just glad they're gone. But yeah, I was not surprised to hear that answer, by the way. I was not surprised to hear that answer, but you have touched on so many interesting things, and we don't have too much time left. So one of the first things I want to talk about is the last thing you said, which is that the fight brought people together and created this powerful neighborhood association that actually gets stuff done, and so that is one of the beauties of beating the big guys, is it does bring people together, and you do meet new people and you do make new friends. And even on the bad days there will be some days that you thought you were going to have a big success and it didn't go as you hoped it would, but at least you still have the friends that you made and the bonds that were created when you got together to beat the big guys. And I'm so glad you brought this up.
And it helps to win. By the way, but yeah, no, absolutely. It's a very inspiring, and we're doing this again in another community. The capacity of people to come together and challenge the status quo is always there. It just takes a certain kind of triggering point, right? Something to a tripwire to kind of set that all off. And in this case, it was this 6-story high mountain of shingles.
Right, and then. Yes, absolutely. And another thing you did, which is really important, is y'all did a spoof on the Law and Order, and you use humor, which is really a very effective tool for bringing people over to hear your side. It works a whole lot better than anger. In my book, Words Whispered in Water, one of the very first things we did was we created a satire spoofing our big guys that we were fighting against, the Army Corps of Engineers, and their cozy relationship with the organization that was supposed to be their peer review. Okay. Very cozy relationship. In fact, they paid them directly and then gave them medals of honor before the work was even done. So we created a 1-minute video using children, and
Right.
I, it got
Ridicule,
unfathomable coverage.
no, there's no question. This is an old Alinsky, a bromide, is that ridicule is the most powerful weapon. They can't stand being laughed at. Now, I think certainly the last 4 or 5 years has put that to the test. Sometimes with shameless people, I'm not sure it's as effective a tactic, but for governments and bureaucracies, for the most part, being ridiculed is lethal sometimes. Yeah.
I totally agree. They don't know what to do when they're being laughed at. I mean, they come apart at the seams, and it's a very, very effective tool, especially when you're using children or animals, things like that. Do it. It works very, very well. So something else.
The cuter, the better, right?
The cuter, the better. Absolutely. Go for it. And it works so much better than anger. And anger is not good for your soul anyway. So those are all win-win. There's something else that you mentioned that I've never discussed in any of my episodes, and we're now in season 3. So I'm so glad you brought it up. And that was the power of a well-written press release. So it sounds like that Ms. Jackson, Ms. Marcia Jackson, and this poor woman, what she's been through. I'd love to meet her one day, but she's a resident going about her day and doing a job. No, she doesn't know how to write a press release, or would even know where to send it if she did know how to write a good press release. So for someone to come in and do this was very, very important and powerful. And it's something that is actually not that difficult. And the reason it's not is all you have to do is open up any newspaper or go online and look at any story, and stories are written basically in the form of a press release.
And many newspapers these days print nothing but press releases, let's be honest.
Right. And so just use an article as a model, as a template, and just stick in the names and the issues, and there you have it.
But you'd be surprised at how many. I mean, it sounds more simple than it is if you don't know the formatting and the protocol and all that. And that's kind of an example of what it is that we do. We're the kind of group that will come in and kind of be the scouts for a grassroots group. We won't be the grassroots group, right? In this case, there's a group called Neighbors United that took on that whole fight, but we were their guides through a landscape that they are totally unfamiliar with most of the time. Regulatory landscape, media landscape, political landscape. How do you make these landscapes work for you? How do you negotiate them? Where are the friendly spots? Where are the spots you want to keep away from? What are the feuds you need to know about? What are the shortcuts we may or may not be able to take because of this person being in power here, or the relationship that you have with this other person, and so forth. So it's that kind of, it's not taking the place of their power. It's kind of advising them on how best to use their power, if that makes sense, on how to get the biggest bang for their buck.
Absolutely.
And that would be,
so, and in the case,
I was just going to say, I would hope that's the case with the college too, that we teach people how to be more effective hellraisers, right? Not to be just to focus and get stuff done.
So if you, let's suppose you're in the listeners to my podcast, it's a nationwide audience. So suppose you live in Maine or in Oregon, and suppose one of my listeners or our listeners today is got some bad guys in their neighborhood and they need to write a press release. So how would you advise a listener in Maine or in Oregon who needs to alert the press of their shingle mountain? What would you say to that listener?
Plagiarism is the biggest compliment, right? So you just go out and look at what other groups have done. You use that's what I did. Partly is just copy what was in front of me, or what I saw, or what I received through this channel or that, And plus, it helps to read newspapers. You said open the newspaper. Who opens a newspaper these days? I'm sorry, none of the people in, my board is now 20 and 30 something women. They get, I doubt if two of them actually subscribe to a hard copy newspaper. So that is part of the problem, is that a lot of times, I've seen this, that very, very bright folks will write what they think is a press release, and it will actually be more like a feature article, right? It won't be the kind of who, what, where, cut to the chase kind of thing you need to do that kind of writing. And it's because they might not have been exposed to that in a way that oldsters like myself would have been over. When there were multiple newspapers a day to read.
I admit, you got me. I did show my age when I said open a newspaper. When I founded the group levies.org 16 years ago, we had not one, but two daily papers in New Orleans. So for me, so I showed my age a little bit there. And then I don't know if you noticed, but I did say, or go online and look at articles online.
No, it's really difficult. Part of the problem for getting this, for coverage of any of these kinds of fights, is the lack of beat reporting right now.
Right.
The lack of local reporting.
So what would you suggest? So you've just said it's hard, but you've got to have some advice for our listeners.
Everybody's trying to figure. The media people can't tell you what to do, much less folks like me. All we advise people to do is to become your own along with everything else you have to do. You also now have to be on your own media company. And by the way, you have to have it on these 5 different platforms that all demand a daily presence, and they demand you monitoring that so you can respond and troll who you have to, or put the news out that you have to, and so on. It's almost more demanding than it was before in terms of monitoring everything and watching it. But you have to become your own journalist, right? I mean,
right. That's definitely true. And this is a good time to point out to our listeners, if the media won't write about your shingle mountain, okay, you can write about it and you can become the journalist. And that's actually very effective. And you can spread the word around using your email account and spread the word around and become a journalist. And the most powerful journalist is the unpaid one. So in other words, it's the resident, like Ms. Marcia Jackson. She has more power in her fingertips than a journalist does, because she's unpaid, and she therefore is more credible. But first she has to get heard, and that is the hard part.
She doesn't
that's why
own the
we're
real
here today.
estate on the front page, right?
Right. She has to get heard, and it is tough. I think this is a really challenging question. How do you write a press release? I'm going to suggest something. Call a local ad agency and tell them who you are and what you're doing, and say, I'm a resident and I don't have any money, but would you consider writing a press release on this shingle mountain? And that could work. That could work. You could get it.
And I don't mean to, there are all kinds of self-help, like the War Resisters League has a whole press packet on how to do that. I think the Midwest Academy may have that. I'm not sure, but you can go online on, just Google how to write a press release, and you'll get half a dozen to a dozen, fairly empathetic responses about how you do this for the first time and so on.
And
here's an example.
That hard. It really is. The who, what, where. It's not hard. There just is a specific template. Right? There is a template. Yeah. And if you don't follow this template, you don't follow this template, it won't get looked at, and it'll be thrown in the trash. Not literally. It'll get deleted.
You actually also appreciate the precision of language then, because you have to pick your words carefully and pick the most active verbs, right? And make it, make the headline stick out as much as you can and make it as provocative as you can and so forth. And how do you do that and so on? So it really makes you think about choosing your words and how you describe and frame your fight as you're doing this. Yeah.
And chances are, if you are the sort of person that's willing to take on this challenge and take on these big guys, odds are you've thought about this, and odds are you've got a pretty good word choice already in your mind because you're living with it and it's keeping you up at night, and you think you're worried that it's going to kill you or make you very, very sick. So
yeah, the press release is probably not going to be at the top of your concerns, but it does, it is good to have your third eye about it sometimes, right? Sometimes you get so in the woods and so in the weeds about it that it's hard to describe it to civilians that are not involved in your fight directly. There's so many acronyms, or there's so many things that you're taking for granted that everybody should know that nobody knows outside of your circle of friends, that it's good to have a reality check. Oh, I'm informing people that know absolutely nothing about this. You have to always assume they know absolutely. You're starting from scratch. What is it that you need to know about this?
That is an excellent, excellent point. Assume they know nothing because
always.
people are busy. People are busy. They're busy with what they're doing. As Dale Carnegie once said, people are busy thinking about what they're going to do in the next 10 minutes, what they're going to do in the next 24 hours, and what they're going to do in the next 7 days. So assume they know nothing about your cause. Jim, is there anything else, any words of encouragement or advice that you'd like to share with our listeners before we close?
There's just, I think a lot of our success is due to persistence, and that's awfully hard to do when you're not being paid to do this work, or when everybody is telling you you're crazy, or there's nothing there, or you're taking the wrong approach. If you feel in your gut that you are right, I have found that it pays to be persistent. Now, how long you're willing to be persistent, that is always an ongoing fight. My first fight was over a decade and I lost it. And my second fight was over a decade and I kind of won it, but not really until 4 years later. So I'm not it takes a long, change is hard. Change is hard, and persistent pays off, and just keep at it.
Well, my cause that I took on was a decade and we won. So it's always, it's going to take longer than you thought it would take, and it's going to be harder than you thought it was going to be, but it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth it. So Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope all of you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on all your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you can beat the big guys. Okay, stay with me. I'm just going to stop recording.